Welcome to Going Underground with me, Afshin Ratansi. Every Monday, Wednesday and Saturday, we're bringing you the stories that really matter in the United Kingdom, but we're not following the party line. In today's show, Peter Hitchens tells us that Britain has no future and David Cameron, multiculturalism and the loss of an empire are to blame. We'll look at where the Education Secretary, Michael Gove, may soon be sipping gin and tonics. And Jeremy Hunt could soon be able to close down any hospital he likes to funnel the money into privately funded trusts nearby. For these stories and more, let's go underground. 1 minute the government is trying to go to war with Syria, the next it's talking about taking in refugees. Peter Hitchens, unlike his late brother Christopher, has long argued against foreign wars, whether it be Syria, Iraq or Libya. He believes Britain has chosen the wrong future at home as well as abroad, and that the Conservative Party under David Cameron is just not the way forward. With me is Peter Hitchens, columnist on the Mail on Sunday. Welcome, Peter. You've been a member of the Labour Party, the Conservative Party. Now you're saying the Conservative Party is useless. Why?
Well, worse than useless. It's a positive menace. It stands in the way of a proper Conservative formation in Britain. As long as it keeps holding on to the loyalty of those millions of voters who mistakenly think it's a Conservative Party, it prevents the development of a proper Conservative Party in this country, which has never been more badly needed.
So are you Conservative in terms of Harold Macmillan or
No, the Conservative Party has never been particularly politically conservative. It always says that it's a disposition without a dogma, which is all very well when your opponents are not dogmatic. But it's faced now a century of Fabian socialism, and in recent years a huge and very significant attempt to transform this country through a cultural and moral revolution. Now, if you don't oppose that, and if you don't understand what you're opposing, then you will eventually become part of it. This country would not be, for instance, so indebted or so heavily taxed if it hadn't decided to get rid of the married family as the principal social unit. But it has, and the state's now trying to substitute for it. Can't do it, costs a fortune, and is socially incredibly destructive.
So why does David Cameron still go on about the importance of family if he's triangulating?
Because he's a public relations man. He's not a politician. He is a public relations man. He wants to be in office, but he doesn't actually want to do anything when he's in office apart from being in office. He has no purpose except being there. The great triumph of the 1960s was the beginning of the long march through the institutions of the generation that I belong to, the university generation, who were instinctively left-wing on all issues, particularly the social, cultural and moral ones. And they now are. They're in all the quangos, they're in all the government departments, they are the lawyers, they are the judges, they are the chief constables, the police officers. They're absolutely crammed into the media, and they've had their way over most things. They've legislated, they're unacknowledged legislators, to change this country into somewhere completely different from the one that it was in 1960.
So in terms of what you termed Fabian socialism, or perhaps social democratic consensus or whatever, you don't see in any way that things have got better since 1960 in terms of whether it be life expectancy, the child poverty, all
You're
the
mistaking
things.
material issues for moral and social issues. Bicycle brakes have got better. Restaurant meals have got better.
I was thinking about housing and food and healthcare and heating.
Architecture, though still appalling, isn't quite as bad as it was. And materially, people may be, for the moment, better off. Though whether you can sustain material prosperity in a society going through a moral disaster, I'm not sure. One of the features of a morally decaying society is debt. Not merely private debt, but enormous public debt under which this country groans and which threatens, it seems to me, its position as a major economic power.
So in this kind of scenario that you're painting, do you see the threat of civil strife in terms of civil violence on the streets of Britain?
No, I don't think that it would take that form. Apart from anything else, there really isn't any political or social movement which would embody itself in things like that. What you will see is a decay, a small-scale decay in civility. The so-called riots a couple of summers ago were wrongly described as riots. They were just outbreaks of completely lawless criminality, unrestrained for a long period of time by a feeble and demoralised police force, and then unpunished by an equally feeble cardboard criminal justice system.
Would you say the same?
But it wasn't political. It was simply a consequence of years and years and years of moral retreat.
Would you say they're different to the rioting we saw in the 1980s in Toxteth and Brixton? So?
No, well, it's similar. Those were also, in many cases, mischaracterised as riots by people who had political purposes and took the view, which many radicals do, that you should never let a good crisis go to waste. If you actually read, for instance, the Scarman report on the so-called Brixton riots, you'll find that they weren't really riots at all. They were an outbreak, again, of organised criminality, which was then used by people
Lord
who wanted
Scarman
to
was
make.
very clear.
Have you read
indeed.
the Scarman report?
Yes, in its entirety. Lord Scarman was very clear that people didn't feel that they were part of their society at large.
Well, he was very clear on that, but if you read the evidence of what actually happened, it was an outbreak of criminality. It was an outbreak of criminality. That's, if you read the evidence of the report, rather than the completely irrelevant conclusion, which Lord Scarman, who was himself a political radical, placed on the end of it, then you see that the pretext for the social changes and the legal and police changes that he wanted was something which hadn't actually happened.
So, you're not a decadent man. Do you see in this voyage away from what was before 1960, does that mean Britain's finished?
Well, probably. My view is that I'm the obituary.
But that's not true. I mean, you obviously don't believe Britain's finished.
I tried to imagine that things that I wrote might make a difference, and I found that really they didn't. When I urged my readers to do the one thing which might have changed the direction of the country.
Vote UKIP.
No, I've never. I will tell people to vote UKIP sometimes tactically. I don't support UKIP. It's a ridiculous Dad's Army blazer and cravat party with no future except as a battering ram against the Tory party. What I begged them to do at the last election was not to vote for the Conservative Party. Had the Conservative Party been as badly beaten as it deserved to be at the last election, instead of just beaten, it would have collapsed and split. And then we could have had the possibility of change, which I spoke of at the beginning of our discussion.
Which is some sort of atavistic idea of going Britain before 1960?
What do you mean atavistic? No. The past is lost and irrecoverable. It's an extraordinary feature of political radicals who don't even realise that they are radicals. They invariably imagine that those who criticise the present from a conservative point of view wish to go back to an imagined golden age. There is no golden age. There never was. The past is gone, even if you wanted to go back. What we have done is chosen the wrong future.
In that future, the death penalty is something that many people in this country believe is right. You've been a vocal advocate for it.
Well, we have the death penalty.
Going back?
We have the death penalty in this country, but it's now carried out by individual policemen with guns. I prefer a death penalty with due process, jury trial, presumption of innocence, possibility of reprieve, and a free press, rather than a policeman opening fire in a state of some panic and fear in a dark
Ruth
street.
Ellis versus Mark Duggan.
Well, if you like to put it as crudely as that, personally, had I been Home Secretary, I would have reprieved Ruth Ellis. But that's a different matter. But that is exactly the point which I'm making. Whereas there was no possibility of reprieving Mark Duggan. The shot was fired. He was dead. It's over. But we have a death penalty. It's just a question of what kind you want to have.
Do you think one element of your kind of is a bit Hegelian, backwards and forwards, is the end of empire? Because you've talked about how you think Britain scuttled away from empire.
We didn't scuttle away from empire. We were driven away from empire by the United States, which ordered us, pretty much on pain of bankruptcy, to demolish our empire at Bretton Woods, and subsequently continued the pressure through the Marshall Plan to do so.
Which Britain paid off a couple of years ago.
Do
you want the empire again?
Well, it's ludicrous to talk about having the empire again. It's gone and is irrecoverable. So no, but I think that in looking back on our history, we should recognise that it wasn't entirely a bad thing. It had its faults, but that's a historical discussion. Look, in this world,
but I'm just trying to get your opinion.
In this world, you either have an empire or you're part of somebody else's. And if you had to choose to be in any of the empires of the past 2,000 years, I think the British Empire would come pretty high on the list of ones you'd rather be part of. Well, we are currently part of the European Union, which is an empire. It's just a modern, politically correct
German empire.
Well, it is really a German empire, but we can't say that, can we?
So what do you suggest? We do go to other countries? Because you're an unlikely supporter of a hero, maybe, of the anti-war movement from the right. Do you not see that invading other countries is a good thing in terms of creating more empires?
I'm against invading other countries. You have, by doing so, by violating other people's national sovereignty, you ultimately violate your own. And I think that an awful lot of the rhetoric of Western politicians now used over the interventions in Iraq, the attempted intervention in Syria, the intervention in Libya, the intervention in former Yugoslavia, will be used against them, possibly by the Chinese in years to come, when they feel the need to intervene in areas where we don't want them to.
Do you not see that there's
This will come round again.
But do you not see there's a mismatch between what you're saying about Britain's history in terms of being an empire power and your support for non-intervention?
You're making a category error. You're asking me about the past and what I think about it. And I'm giving you an opinion about the past, which is an opinion about history, which informs my political view about the present. It doesn't dictate it. It doesn't say because I think that the British Empire was in its time better than certain other empires we could mention that I want to recreate it.
One legacy of empire, of course, famously is immigration, mass immigration between different countries. I don't know whether...
It's not a legacy of empire. It's a deliberate policy followed by the British government over years to encourage immigration from certain parts of the world.
So you don't see countries with empires having more immigration?
Sorry?
Countries with empires have more immigration than
Not
others.
necessarily.
You don't see that the colonies of Britain have lots of people in this country?
Well, they do, but they didn't have to be here, and there's no reason why, apart from the fact that the British government, through various acts of Parliament and other measures, encouraged them to come here. There's no reason why they're here. It's not because we had an empire that they're here. It's because we chose to invite them to come.
Do you think that society at large in Britain suffers because of that multiculturalism?
Well, I think anybody suffers from multiculturalism because multiculturalism is no culture. It means that there's nothing to be loyal to, nothing to belong to. And I think any society which hopes to survive has to have an agreed culture, starting with an agreed language.
Do you believe that there's a monocultural past?
Oh, very much so, yes, unquestionably.
What is that?
Well, it's recognisably the British culture which existed more or less.
British, after the Glorious Revolution, or
English? The Glorious Revolution, as you rightly call it, is an extremely significant moment in the creation of it, yeah.
Do you support independence, Scottish independence?
Look, I think if Scotland votes for independence, then Scotland must be independent, but I would very much rather that Scotland remain part of the United Kingdom.
How do you think this liberalism and the 60s intertwines with foreign adventures abroad, and how things are going to progress when it comes to the idea that this is a great country, we should export it?
Well, it's very much bound up with them because one of their crucial ideas was that the borders of the world should go, that national loyalties were reactionary and outdated. And this goes back actually to the Communist Manifesto of 1848. It's always been a strand of Marxism which people forgot during the Soviet era because the Soviet Union became itself so nationalistic. But Marxism has always been internationalist, and the reason why my late brother was so keen on the United States invading everywhere was because he saw the United States now as the great engine of the global borderless utopian world which he longed for. He remained an admirer of Leon Trotsky until his dying day.
And you, on the
and
other
hand... also the United States government. An interesting combination. People should reflect not on what that means for Leon Trotsky, but on what that means for the United States government.
But you, on the other hand, believe in a different type of world, which is what sort of Little England isolation.
What is little about England?
It doesn't have an empire.
England, no, but it remains. The English language is spoken all over the world.
It's about the language.
English ideas of law and liberty are followed in all the most successful countries on the planet. English culture and
the language is not a heritage of immigration. It's nothing to do with immigration.
I'm saying England. It is absurd to call England little. From this small island, enormous and very valuable things have flowed for civilization and continue to do so.
Peter Hitchens, thank you.
My pleasure.
Coming up, is David Cameron really not getting on with the French president, or are they actually discussing mass murder at a pub? That's after this short break. Read all about it or not, the newspaper industry has always known the importance of attention-grabbing headlines, but just how misleading or ridiculous do they get? Here at Going Underground, we don't think the public should be misinformed, so catch our breaking views on the past week's breaking news.
Pow wow POW, Taliban claim to have captured a dog belonging to the British Army that was carrying 4 guns and grenades.
What? I know the Daily Mail has been next to useless when it comes to covering the reasons why British troops are occupying Afghanistan, but where are they getting this story from? Well, it turns out their source is an online video. For further insight, the Mail quotes a Taliban spokesman saying, "This dog was very important to the Americans. Once we got this dog, the Americans tried their best to get it back, but they did not succeed."
Hollande and Cameron's pub lunch unlikely to improve ailing entente.
So The Guardian thinks the mini-summit of David Cameron and Francois Hollande didn't go too well. But look below this pub lunch headline, and buried deep in the article is a sentence about how defence matters were the least prickly issue between the two nations. The Guardian didn't mention that these supposed enemies managed to sign off on a £200 million joint project on killer drones.
Polish mothers have more children once they come to Britain.
When the Mail isn't suggesting we fear immigrants from space, we get headlines like this one. Except that the statistics show that while Polish women are more likely to have children in England and Wales than back in Poland, they actually have fewer babies than the average for foreign-born mothers living in England and Wales.
Urgent scare in Downing Street. Has a bug been found in the cabinet room?
Forget austerity, the breakup of the United Kingdom and the UK's wars on Syria and Afghanistan. There's apparently a disease called bronchitis destroying the cabinet. The Daily Express helpfully adds that the main symptom is a cough, which may bring up yellow-grey mucus. Expect Armageddon shortly then.
Welcome to the year of the whores. People around the globe celebrate.
Although not technically a headline, this was too good to pass up. Yet another subtitle blunder from the BBC. They meant to welcome us to the Chinese Year of the Horse, but instead welcomed us to a great year for sex workers. Even though they wrote off £100 million on failed computer contracts and employ more than 25,000 people, they don't seem to have the money to fix a system that once referred to the head of the Church of England as the Arch-Bitch of Canterbury and called for a moment's violence when the Queen Mother died. MPs are currently debating a little-known but very powerful clause slotted into the Care Bill. If passed, it would allow Jeremy Hunt to close any hospital in England, not only for clinical but also financial reasons. The coalition saw the campaign to save Lewisham Hospital in London as a setback. It was a victory against the government for all who opposed mass privatisation and top-down reorganisation of the NHS. But the GP who chaired that campaign against Jeremy Hunt feels it's an issue that's not just local. She says there's a global context to demolishing the NHS, and she's standing in the May European elections for the National Health Action Party to fight against Labour, Tory and Liberal Democrat. With me is Louise Irvine. She's the MEP candidate for London for the National Health Action Party, and she was the chair of the Save Lewisham Hospital campaign. Welcome, Louise.
Thank you.
Of course, that Lewisham campaign was victorious against the government. Yes. Do you think Jeremy Hunt, the Health Secretary, has ever or will ever forgive you?
Well, I'm worried about that. I think we showed that a community campaign can organise and can fight and can take on the government, and we won. We won twice, actually, in the High Court and then in the Court of Appeal.
And the taxpayer paid for all the Jeremy Hunt's
for Jeremy Hunt's court costs, but we raised our money from the community.
So how more do you think he's going to attack, say, people like you and your party, National Health Action?
Well, I think Lewisham can't be seen in a bubble. It's not isolated. We've won for the time being, but it's part of the whole NHS, and the whole NHS is under attack, severe attack, by this present government. Privatisation, massive multi-billion-pound cuts. So we know that this was, if you like, a battle won in a longer war to try to save our NHS.
There's some people saying that this clause 118 of the Care Bill may be a way of sneaking legislation that will stop people like you ever being victorious again.
Yes, exactly. The grounds on which we won in Lewisham were that the government had appointed a special administrator to try to sort out the problems of another trust that was in deficit. And the reason that other healthcare trust was in deficit was because of unpayable, toxic private finance initiative debts. Yet that special administrator, instead of dealing with that, looked beyond the borders of that trust to the neighbouring Lewisham Healthcare Trust, which was solvent, popular, well-performing.
And said, shut that down.
And said, yes, shut that, because that way, when we close that hospital, patients will be funneled into the troubled PFI indebted hospitals, money follows patients, and that will help to shore up that. So we were able to argue in court that the legislation for the Trust Special Administrator said that they could only make decisions in relation to the trust to which they were appointed, and not other trusts, and that's the basis on which we won. So the government is pushing through legislation very rapidly to allow special administrators to be appointed to any trust in deficit to make decisions about any other trust in the area, and they haven't even defined the area. It could be very large, which are necessary or consequential. Decisions will be able to be taken by unaccountable bureaucrats. All the normal checks and balances to review important decisions about reconfiguring local hospitals have been removed. There's not even a requirement to consult the public. They only have to do one public meeting. So this is a recipe for bad legislation, bad decisions.
Do you think basically they don't like the Bevan model of the NHS at all and think that corporations are successful, run it like private corporations?
I think so. I think, Tory...
Or do you think it's corruption? Is it an ideological thing, or is it because of corrupt lobbying?
We have evidence that leading Tories have actually made statements such as the NHS is a 50-year-old mistake. Even Clegg said that NHS should be broken up. We've had others saying it's ripe for privatisation. There's lots of money to be made out of it. Oliver Letwin, who's a minister in our current government, said that the NHS should be privatised. He wrote a book called Privatising the World, in which he advocated privatisation because they believe ideologically that privatisation works. And there has been massive lobbying, mainly by United States huge healthcare corporations and insurance companies, for these kind of changes.
Well, will it be too late then? I mean, you're going for the MEP job for London. Will it be too late by the time the National Health Action Party does anything in terms of power? 70% of NHS contracts since April 2013 in the private sector.
Well, it's not 70% of all contracts. Since April, £5 billion worth of contracts have been put up for sale. Of those contracts that have been awarded, 70% have gone to the private sector, and less than half of that gone to the NHS, and only about 2 to charities. So what we're seeing is a beginning, what we warned is coming to pass, of an acceleration of privatisation, but we're still nowhere near that yet. We still have a National Health Service, and we still have a population that values it and understands it.
But surely these private elements within the NHS, which make the NHS worse, certainly anecdotally for people on the street, will make them, instead of going, let's go back to what it was, we'll go, well, this is so bad, maybe the Tories are right, it should be changed in some more fundamental way, and that way is the American style,
yes, well,
pre-Obama or Obama.
Yes, there are two things happening. The NHS is being run down, and the more it appears to be failing, it's not failing, but the government is constantly talking it down and saying something has to be done, and then there's something that has to be done, and seems to be the private sector. But secondly, I think we need to talk about the EU-US trade agreement, which hardly ever gets talked about in public. But that will lock in privatisation if that's passed.
I mean, the European Union, of course, enshrines privatisation in so many of its treaties.
Yes, and this treaty with between Europe and the US would mean that private companies could actually sue the British government if a government came in that wanted to reverse the privatisation that's happened and to stop any more private contracts going out. The government could be sued, not in British courts, but in foreign secret courts, which are not presided over by judges, but by corporate lawyers. And you never know what's actually the details of these courts. And this has happened already with other free trade agreements around the world, where governments have been successfully sued by corporations for millions of dollars and been forced to reverse legislation that the governments had brought in to protect the public, protect citizens in terms of environmental or health rights.
The Tories are Eurosceptic, so presumably they will stand a better chance at destroying the EU legislation that will presumably destroy the NHS, according to you.
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting the Tories haven't talked about this. They say that they're in favour of this EU-US trade agreement. They think it's a fantastic opportunity. Cameron's on record saying that. So although they try to pander to UKIP by criticising Europe, the main thing that they're not talking about is this trade agreement, which will definitely damage the public sector and the NHS. So I think that they're being totally dishonest about this. I don't think the NHS would survive another 5 years of a Conservative government. The Conservatives are ideologically committed to replacing a public sector, public service with a privatised service. Labour is in a muddle. It's partly committed to an NHS, but it thinks it can flirt with privatisation and that somehow that will all work out. We're seeing that that's not the case.
So in the May elections, the National Health Action Party, you're going to have to persuade people that Labour and the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats are not the people to vote for, though.
If I standing in London for the MEP elections, it's a proportional representation. So a vote for me is not a wasted vote. It's not going to split the vote. It's a positive vote. And I think sending someone like me to the European Parliament will enable me and my party, the National Health Action Party, to reach out to many more people. And we feel the main problem with this NHS privatisation is that most people don't know about it. And most people don't know about all the other issues I've talked about, the Private Finance Initiative or the EU-US trade agreement. And they have to know about it. If they knew what was really happening to their NHS, they would be out in the streets. Lewisham, 1,000 times over, would be happening around the country.
Louise Irvin, thank you.
Thank you.
Hedge fund boss Edmund Lazarus, who has bankrolled Education Secretary Michael Gove with thousands of pounds, is looking to build one of the biggest basement extensions ever seen in central London. Well, it will no doubt make his £16 million villa seem even more special. Lazarus, who went to Oxford with Gove, runs Bregal Capital, which attracted controversy when he set up a private schools company, Cognita. Previously, he worked at Morgan Stanley. That's the group that just paid £800 million to settle lawsuits in America. Mr. Lazarus, who is a keen supporter of the government's austerity policies, is seeking planning permission to dig under a mansion he purchased in London. He wants to build a cinema, wine cellar, swimming pool, staff quarters, and a cigar room. Oh, and his new extension will also have space for 6 cars with a convenient lift. And how much will the extra 16,000 square feet cost him? £10 million. Given he's only paid £95,000 or so to David Cameron, maybe he can put a little more effort when it comes to donations ahead of the general election. As for the extension, Lazarus has also bankrolled Mayor Boris Johnson, so maybe he won't have to worry about planning permission. Join us next time as we go underground to bring you the latest beneath the mainstream from around the UK. Don't forget, you can drop us a line on Twitter at underground_RT, like our page on Facebook, or email us goingunderground@rttv.co.uk. See you on Wednesday.